He saw a waitress, a ghost in a black and white uniform, insignificant, a mere tool to deliver his $500 steak. He saw a woman he could mock with impunity in a language he believed was his secret shield. Leaning towards his esteemed German partners, he began his tirade, his words slick with arrogance, painting her as a simple-minded peasant, utterly clueless. He chuckled, his guests smirked, and the world in that opulent restaurant continued to spin on his axis of power. But he didn't see the truth. He didn't see the Ivy League scholar hiding in plain sight. He didn't hear the silent ticking of a time bomb, and he was about to learn, in the most public and humiliating way possible, that some ghosts don't just haunt, they hunt. The Ethelgard restaurant wasn't just a place to eat, it was a theater of power. Its patrons didn't merely dine, they performed. Deals worth more than most people's lifetimes were signed over plates of seared scallops and glasses of vintage Bordeaux. The air itself felt expensive, thick with the scent of truffle oil, old leather, and unspoken ambition. For Ilara Vance, it was a gilded cage, and for the last 18 months, she had been one of its invisible birds. Every shift was a study in self-erasure. She learned to modulate her voice to a pitch of pleasant neutrality, to perfect a smile that was warm but not familiar, and to move through the narrow aisles with a dancer's grace, becoming a fleeting presence that fulfilled a need and vanished. Her uniform, a crisp white shirt and a severe black apron, was her camouflage. To the clientele, she wasn't Ilara Vance, former linguistics prodigy from Brown University, fluent in 4 languages. She was simply Miss, or more often, nothing at all, just a pair of hands that refilled water glasses and cleared away finished plates. This anonymity was both a prison and a sanctuary. It was a constant, grinding reminder of how far she had fallen. 2 years ago, she had been celebrating the acceptance of her doctoral thesis on Germanic linguistic evolution. Her father, David Vance, the brilliant founder of Vance Innovations, a boutique green energy firm, had been there, his eyes shining with pride. He'd toasted to her future, a future that seemed as bright and limitless as the solar technology he was pioneering. Then the world had shattered. A hostile takeover, ruthless and surgically precise, had devoured her father's company. The orchestrator was a corporate predator, a phantom known only through whispers on financial news channels. They'd used leveraged debt, exploited a legal loophole, and bled Vance Innovations dry in less than 6 months. The stress, the betrayal, had been too much for her father's heart. He was gone within the year, leaving Ilara with a mountain of debt, a shattered spirit, and a name that was now synonymous with failure in the world she once called her own. So she vanished. She packed away her degrees, her accolades, her past, and became a waitress. The work was grueling, the pay barely enough to cover the rent on her tiny apartment and the payments on her father's lingering medical bills. But it was honest, and it was anonymous. Here at Ethelgard's, no one knew her. No one could look at her with pity. Ilara, table 7 is getting impatient. The sharp voice of the manager, Mr. Dubois, cut through her thoughts. He was a man who worshipped punctuality and starched linen in equal measure. On it, Mr. Dubois, she replied, her professional smile clicking into place. She approached table 7, a family celebrating a birthday, their laughter gratingly loud. She took their dessert orders with practiced efficiency, her mind already on the next task. As she walked back toward the kitchen, she passed Samuel, a veteran waiter in his late 50s with kind, weary eyes. "Rough night?" he asked quietly, polishing a wine glass until it gleamed. "Is there any other kind?" she replied with a half smile. "You're better than this place, kid," he said, a familiar refrain. "I see it in your eyes. You don't belong here." "We all belong where we have to be, Samuel," she said softly, the words tasting like ash. "This is where I have to be." He just shook his head, a sad understanding on his face. He didn't know her story, not the details, but he sensed the chasm between the person she was and the role she was playing. A sudden hush fell over the front of the restaurant, a subtle shift in the ambient hum. It was the kind of silence that only happened when a true heavyweight entered the room. Ilara glanced towards the grand entrance. Mr. Dubois was practically bowing, his usual stiffness replaced by an obsequious reverence. 3 men stood there, silhouetted by the city lights behind them. 2 were older, with stern European faces and impeccably tailored suits. But it was the man in the center who commanded all the attention. He was younger, perhaps in his late 30s, with sharp features, slicked back dark hair, and eyes that swept across the room with an air of dismissive ownership. He wore a custom-tailored Brioni suit that probably cost more than Ilara's annual salary. He radiated a cold, predatory charisma. His name was Julian Croft. Ilara didn't know his name yet, but she felt a primal sense of unease settle in her stomach. He was the apex predator, and this was his hunting ground. "The Croft party is here," Mr. Dubois announced to the staff in a hushed, urgent tone. "He has the VIP reservation for the private alcove. I want flawless service. Flawless. Ilara, you're the most polished. You're on." A wave of dread washed over her. Serving the regular rich was one thing. Serving the architects of the universe was another. Their scrutiny was sharper, their condescension more cutting. "Yes, Mr. Dubois," she said, her voice betraying none of her inner turmoil. She smoothed her apron, took a deep breath, and prepared to erase herself once more. As she walked towards the alcove, the man, Julian Croft, laughed at something one of his companions said. The sound was sharp and cruel, and for a reason she couldn't explain, it sent a shiver of ice down her spine. It was a sound she felt she had heard before, in a nightmare she couldn't quite remember. The private alcove at Ethelgard's was the restaurant's inner sanctum. Tucked away behind a velvet curtain, it offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, a glittering tapestry of lights that seemed to bow before the occupant's ego. The table was set with heavy silver cutlery and crystal glasses that refracted the candlelight into 1,000 tiny rainbows. It was a space designed to make a man feel like a king. Julian Croft settled into the plush leather chair at the head of the table, as if it were a throne. His companions, two German executives named Klaus Richter and Marcus Weber, took their seats on either side. Klaus was older, with a mane of silver hair and a stoic, thoughtful expression. Marcus was younger, leaner, with the keen, hungry look of a man on the rise. They were the top brass from Richter Automotive, a venerable German engineering firm known for its groundbreaking battery technology. Ilara entered the alcove, her presence as quiet as a sigh. "Good evening, gentlemen. My name is Ilara, and I will be your server tonight. May I begin with some water for the table? We have a sparkling San Pellegrino or still Evian." She spoke with the detached professionalism she had perfected. She avoided direct eye contact, focusing instead on a point just over their shoulders. It was a trick to remain present but unobtrusive. Julian Croft didn't even look at her. He waved a dismissive hand. "Sparkling, and bring the 2005 Chateau Margaux. Don't bother with the wine list." "An excellent choice, sir," Ilara said, her tone even. "I'll decant that for you right away." As she turned to leave, Julian began speaking to his guests in fluent, confident German. Ilara's ears pricked up instinctively. It was a reflex, a deeply ingrained part of who she was. The language was as natural to her as English, a gift from her German-born mother and years of academic immersion. She didn't have to try to understand. The words simply registered, bypassing the English part of her brain entirely. "You see," Julian said in German, his voice laced with amusement, "in America, even the finest establishments are staffed by these simple people. You just have to know how to handle them. Project an aura of absolute authority." Klaus Richter gave a non-committal grunt, looking slightly uncomfortable. Marcus Weber, however, offered a sycophantic smirk. "You have certainly mastered the art, Julian." Ilara felt a hot flush of anger creep up her neck, but she forced it down. She had heard worse. She had been ignored, snapped at, and treated like furniture. This was just another rich man puffing out his chest. It meant nothing. She retreated to the wine cellar, her movements calm and measured, a stark contrast to the sudden turbulence in her mind. When she returned with the wine, she performed the ritual of decanting with meticulous care. Her hands were steady as she poured the ruby-red liquid into the crystal decanter, letting it breathe. As she worked, the conversation at the table continued, a low hum of German business talk. They were discussing the final details of a deal, a partnership. Julian was using his charisma like a weapon, charming his guests, painting a glorious picture of their shared future. The deal was codenamed Project Nightingale. "Project Nightingale will revolutionize the electric vehicle market," Julian declared, his voice resonating with passion. Richter's battery technology combined with Croft Industries' global distribution network and our aggressive marketing, we will be unstoppable. A true fusion of German engineering and American ambition. Klaus Richter nodded slowly. The proposal is indeed impressive, Julian, but our board has concerns about long-term integration. Our company has a culture, a legacy. We are not merely an asset to be acquired. Of course not, Julian scoffed, placing a reassuring hand on Klaus's arm. This is a merger of equals, a partnership. Your legacy will be preserved. It will be amplified on the world stage. Elara placed a glass of the decanted wine before each man, moving with silent efficiency. As she leaned in to serve Julian, his cologne washed over her, a sharp, expensive scent of sandalwood and something metallic like cold steel. He still hadn't made eye contact with her. To him, she was less than human, an automaton. She took their dinner orders. Julian ordered the Wagyu steak, rare, while his guest chose the pan-seared halibut. As she recited the orders back to them for confirmation, her gaze inadvertently met Julian's for the first time. His eyes were a startlingly pale blue, and they held an unnerving emptiness, a complete lack of empathy. They scanned her face for a brief second, and a flicker of something, boredom, disdain, passed through them before he looked away. But in that fleeting moment, that fraction of a second, a jolt went through Elara. It wasn't recognition. It was something deeper, a discordant echo in the recesses of her memory. The arrogant tilt of his head, the specific cadence of his voice when he spoke. It was familiar. Terribly, sickeningly familiar. She pushed the feeling aside, attributing it to stress and fatigue. She was just a waitress. He was just another titan of industry. Their worlds were not meant to intersect. She delivered the orders to the kitchen and returned to her station, keeping a watchful eye on the alcove, her body on autopilot while her mind raced. The men's conversation grew more relaxed as the wine flowed. They moved from business to more personal topics. Julian, growing bolder and more comfortable, began to use Elara's presence as a source of amusement. Each time she entered to refill their water or bring a new course, he would switch to German and make a comment at her expense. "Watch her," he murmured to his guests as Elara placed the bread basket on the table. "Look at that blank expression. Not a thought behind those eyes. It's almost peaceful to be so blissfully unaware." Marcus chuckled. Klaus remained silent, his gaze fixed on his wine glass. Later, when she cleared the appetizer plates, he leaned in and said, "She's pretty, in a rustic sort of way. One can imagine her on a farm somewhere, milking a cow. It's a shame such looks are wasted on a life of servitude." The words were like tiny, poisoned darts. Elara's training, her hard-won emotional armor, was beginning to crack. It wasn't just the insults. It was the absolute certainty with which he delivered them. The assumption that she was deaf to his language, that she was an object, that her feelings were a non-entity, and underneath it all, that nagging, terrifying sense of familiarity grew stronger. The main courses arrived. Elara placed the magnificent Wagyu steak in front of Julian. He cut into it, examined the rare center, and nodded curtly, not at her, but to himself. Then, as she was about to retreat, he looked at Klaus and said the words that would change everything. He spoke in a low, conspiratorial German, a smirk playing on his lips. "You know, the key to a deal like this is to know exactly where the leverage is. You find the weakness, the soft underbelly, and you press until it bursts. That's how I took down a foolish little company a few years back. Vance Innovations. The old man who ran it, David Vance, he thought passion and ideals could compete with ruthless efficiency. He learned the hard way. The world stopped. Vance Innovations. David Vance. The sound of her father's name, spoken with such casual cruelty from this man's mouth, hit Elara like a physical blow. The crystal water pitcher in her hand trembled. The blood drained from her face. The nagging echo in her memory exploded into a full-throated scream. It wasn't just the voice, it was the phrasing. Ruthless efficiency. Those were the exact words from the anonymous letters sent to her father's board of directors, the ones that turned them against him. Suddenly, she was no longer in Ethelgard's. She was back in her father's study, surrounded by stacks of legal documents. She could hear his voice on the phone, strained and broken, pleading with investors. She could hear the cold, disembodied voice on the other end of the conference calls, a voice that spoke with a chillingly precise cadence, a voice that systematically dismantled her father's life's work. It was his voice, Julian Croft's voice. The phantom had a face, and he was sitting right in front of her. The revelation struck Ilara with the force of a physical impact. The air was punched from her lungs. The glittering city skyline outside the window blurred into a smear of indistinct lights. The clinking of cutlery and the low murmur of the restaurant faded into a dull, roaring tsunami in her ears. Julian Croft. He was the architect of her ruin, the man who had destroyed her father, her family, her future. He wasn't just another arrogant customer. He was the ghost that had haunted her for 2 years, now made flesh and blood, sitting less than 3 feet away, complaining that his steak was a degree too warm. Her training, her composure, the carefully constructed fortress of the invisible waitress, crumbled to dust. All that was left was the raw, white-hot agony of grief and a surge of incandescent rage that felt like it could split her in two. Her hand, still holding the water pitcher, shook violently. A few drops of ice water sloshed over the rim, landing silently on the plush carpet. Across the table, Julian was still talking, oblivious. He was basking in the memory of his corporate conquest, using it as a show of strength for his German partners. The old man was a romantic, Julian continued in German, slicing another piece of his steak. He believed in things like corporate family and loyalty. I showed him that the only family in business is the bottom line. The only loyalty is to profit. We acquired his patents for pennies on the dollar after driving him into the ground. It was a masterpiece of strategy. Marcus Weber looked impressed, leaning forward eagerly. A valuable lesson. One must be unsentimental. Even Klaus Richter, who had seemed reserved, nodded with a grudging respect. The market can be unforgiving. Unforgiving. The word was so sterile, so clean. It didn't capture the late-night phone calls, the look of utter defeat in her father's eyes, the way he seemed to physically shrink in the final months of his life. It didn't capture the smell of antiseptic in the hospital room where he drew his last breath. Ilara's knuckles were white where she gripped the pitcher. Her mind was a battlefield. One part of her, the survival instinct, screamed at her to turn and walk away, to flee the alcove, clock out, run from the restaurant and never look back. It was too much, too monstrous a coincidence to bear. But another part, a part she thought had died with her father, began to stir. It was the part that had earned scholarships, that had debated professors, that had inherited David Vance's unyielding belief in right and wrong. It was a cold, quiet voice that whispered, "He doesn't get to do this. He doesn't get to sit here feasting on his victory while you serve him water." Julian, finally noticing her stillness, glanced up. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. He saw only a waitress dawdling. He gestured impatiently at his water glass, which was nearly full. "What is she waiting for?" he said to his companions, his German dripping with disdain. "Is she expecting a tip for standing there and breathing our air? Honestly, the quality of service is slipping. You'd think for these prices, they'd hire people with at least 2 brain cells to rub together." He smirked, looking to Marcus for affirmation. Marcus let out a low chuckle. That was it. That was the final push. The casual, dehumanizing cruelty of it. He wasn't just a monster who had destroyed her past. He was a monster in the present, a bully who derived pleasure from kicking those he perceived to be beneath him. The shaking in Ilara's hand stopped. A profound, chilling calm washed over her. The roaring in her ears subsided, replaced by a crystalline clarity. She knew exactly what she had to do. This moment, this impossible, horrifying intersection of her past and present, was not a curse. It was an opportunity, a chance for a reckoning that she never thought she would get. She straightened her spine. For the first time all night, she lifted her head and looked directly at Julian Croft. She did not look at him as a waitress. She looked at him as Ilara Vance, daughter of David Vance. She let him see the intelligence in her eyes, the fire she had banked for so long. Julian felt the shift. Her direct gaze was so unexpected, so out of place with her role, that it momentarily broke his rhythm. He frowned, a flicker of confusion in his pale blue eyes. Who was this menial servant to look at him with such intensity? He decided to double down on his mockery, to re-establish the hierarchy. Leaning back in his chair with an exaggerated air of nonchalance, he looked her up and down slowly, deliberately. "Perhaps she is admiring my suit," he said in German, his voice loud enough for the entire alcove to hear clearly. "It's understandable. This suit is worth more than she will make in a year, maybe even two. It must be like looking at the sun for a creature that has lived its whole life in a cave." He then turned to Klaus. "This, my friends, is the American dream in action. We get rich, and they get to pour our water. A perfectly balanced ecosystem." He laughed, a smug, self-satisfied sound that echoed the cold, cruel laughter from his phone calls. He expected his guest to laugh with him. He expected the little waitress to either scurry away in humiliation or stand there in bovine ignorance. He did not expect what happened next. Ilara took a single, deliberate step forward. She placed the water pitcher down on the serving tray with a soft, definitive click. The sound seemed to cut through the air. Then in a voice that was low, clear, and utterly devoid of a foreign accent, she responded. She spoke in flawless, academic German. "Your analogy is flawed, Mr. Croft," she began, her tone as sharp and cold as glacial ice. "A creature from a cave, upon seeing the sun, would be blinded by its brilliance. I, however, am not blinded. I see you quite clearly." Silence, a thick, profound, and absolute silence descended upon the table. Marcus Weber's sycophantic smile froze on his face, then melted into slack-jawed disbelief. Klaus Richter's eyes widened, and he sat bolt upright, his wineglass hovering halfway to his lips. But their shock was nothing compared to Julian Croft's. His face, which had been a mask of arrogant amusement, went through a rapid series of transformations. First, confusion, then startled disbelief, and finally the dawning of a horrified, sickening realization. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a pasty, waxen shade. The master of the universe had just discovered that the walls had ears. And not only did they have ears, but they were about to talk back. The air in the private alcove crackled with a tension so thick it was almost suffocating. The three powerful men stared at Ilara, their minds struggling to process the seismic shift that had just occurred. A waitress, a non-entity, a piece of the scenery, had just spoken to them in their native tongue. Not just with fluency, but with an intellectual precision that was jarring. Julian Croft was the first to recover, his shock quickly curdling into fury. This was an unacceptable breach of the natural order. He was the one who held all the cards, who controlled every room he entered. "What did you say?" he snarled, switching to English, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He was trying to regain control, to put her back in her box by changing the linguistic battlefield. Ilara did not follow his lead. She remained in the world he had created, the one where he thought he was safe. She continued in perfect German, her voice steady and unwavering. "I said," she repeated, her eyes locked on his, "that I see you quite clearly. For instance, I see that your German, while passable for business, has some minor grammatical imperfections. Your use of the subjunctive mood in the last sentence was incorrect, a common mistake for those who learn the language for conquest rather than for connection." It was a devastatingly precise strike. She hadn't just revealed that she understood him. She had critiqued him, asserted her intellectual superiority on his own chosen ground. It was a calculated insult, designed to dismantle his aura of effortless command. Marcus Weber let out a small choked gasp. Klaus Richter lowered his wineglass to the table with a soft thud, his expression one of intense, newfound interest. This was no longer dinner. It was a corporate gladiator match, and a surprising new contender had just entered the arena. Julian's face flushed a dark, mottled red. "You are fired," he spat in English. "Get out, now." "Am I?" Ilara replied, again in German, a faint, ironic smile touching her lips. "I don't believe you are my employer, Mr. Croft, though you have certainly had a profound impact on my career path." The veiled reference hung in the air, a drop of poison. Julian's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" My name is Alara Vance, she said, and for the first time in years, she spoke her own name with its full weight, its full history. She watched his face for the flicker of recognition, and she was not disappointed. His pale eyes widened almost imperceptibly. The name registered. Vance. And I have a much more interesting question for you, Herr Richter, Herr Weber, she said, turning her attention to the two German executives. The shift was masterful. She was no longer a waitress being disciplined. She was a stakeholder in this meeting, addressing them as peers. He called your joint venture Project Nightingale, she continued, her German fluid and articulate. Have you ever wondered why he chose that name? Klaus Richter leaned forward, his earlier stoicism replaced by a rapt curiosity. I assumed it was a standard code name. Oh, it's standard for him, Alara said, her gaze returning to Julian, who now looked like a cornered animal. In Greek mythology, the nightingale sings its most beautiful song after its tongue has been cut out, a song of sorrow and suffering, an apt choice for a man who specializes in silencing companies before he picks their bones clean. Julian shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. That is enough. Security. Get this crazy woman out of here. But his guests didn't look at him. They were looking at Alara, captivated. Her words carried the undeniable ring of truth, of deeply personal knowledge. You're making a deal with him for Richter Automotive's revolutionary battery technology, Alara stated, not as a question, but as a fact. He has promised you a merger of equals, a global platform for your innovation. He has painted a beautiful picture. And you claim this picture is false? Klaus asked, his voice low and serious. I claim that the canvas is rotten and the painter is a liar, Alara said, her voice hardening. She then delivered the blow that took the confrontation from a personal grievance to a matter of business. He mentioned a key component of the deal, the transfer of intellectual property to a newly created subsidiary, NC Holdings LLC, registered in Delaware for tax efficiency. Klaus and Marcus exchanged a startled look. That was a confidential detail from the deal's term sheet, known only to the highest-level negotiators. How could a waitress possibly know this? Julian's face was ashen. He had discussed that detail with his legal team on the phone in the car, on the way to the restaurant. He had been careless, arrogant, never imagining that the driver, or a waitress, or anyone in the service class would have the context to understand. This new holding company, Alara pressed on, her voice like a surgeon's scalpel, is designed for one purpose. Once your patents are legally housed within it, Croft Industries will load NC Holdings with an insurmountable amount of debt, leveraging it against Croft's other assets. Within 18 months, NC Holdings will declare bankruptcy. The debt holders, who are, of course, other Croft-controlled entities, will seize the only valuable assets, your patents. Croft gets your life's work for pennies, free of any of the obligations or royalty agreements made to Richter Automotive. Your company will be left a hollow shell. You will be silenced. The Nightingale. She laid out the scheme with such cold, brutal clarity that it was undeniable. It was a classic predatory corporate maneuver, a debt trap asset strip, and it was exactly the kind of masterpiece of strategy Julian had been bragging about just moments before. Marcus Weber looked at Julian, his face a mask of dawning horror and betrayal. Julian, is this true? Julian opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was completely exposed. The waitress hadn't just understood his insults. She understood the intricate, venomous mechanics of his business dealings. She had X-ray vision, and she had seen the rot at the core of his empire. Klaus Richter's face was grim, his eyes like chips of granite. He looked from Julian's panicked expression to Alara's resolute one. He had been in business for 40 years. He knew the look of a liar, and he knew the look of someone speaking a terrible truth. Miss Vance, Klaus said, his voice heavy with implication, how could you possibly know all of this? Alara's gaze, filled with 2 years of repressed pain, settled on Julian Croft. Because he's done it before, she said, her voice finally trembling, not with weakness, but with the sheer weight of her history. He did it to my father. He did it to Vance Innovations. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The unmasking was complete. Julian Croft wasn't just a cheat and a bully. He was a corporate murderer standing trial, and his victim's ghost had just returned to deliver the verdict. The silence that followed Alara's declaration was heavier than any before. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of broken companies and broken men. The name Vance Innovations now hung in the air, no longer a boastful anecdote for Julian, but a damning indictment. Mr. Dubois, the manager, finally arrived, drawn by the sound of Julian shouting. He bustled into the alcove, his face a mess of anxiety and confusion. "Mr. Croft, is there a problem?" He stopped short, sensing the funereal atmosphere. He saw the ashen face of his VIP guest, the stunned and hostile expressions of the German executives, and his waitress Alara, standing not with the deference of an employee, but with the unyielding posture of an accuser. "There is a very large problem, yes," Klaus Richter said in heavily accented English, his cold eyes fixed on Julian. "But not with the service." Julian, seeing the manager, saw a lifeline. He pointed a trembling finger at Alara. "This woman is insane. She's harassing my guests. She's a disgruntled former employee from some company I've never heard of. Dubois, call security. Have her removed. I want her arrested." Mr. Dubois looked at Alara, his mind reeling. "Alara, what is going on?" But Alara ignored them both. Her focus was entirely on the German executives. She had their attention, and she would not relinquish it. She had to finish this. "He won't just steal your patents," she continued, her voice ringing with conviction. "Ask him about his plans for your workforce in Stuttgart. Ask him about the synergistic headcount reductions planned for the first quarter after the merger. He calls it trimming the fat. My father called it destroying families." Marcus Weber, the younger executive, looked physically ill. "We were given assurances, ironclad guarantees about protecting our people." "His guarantees are written in disappearing ink," Alara retorted. "He gave my father the same assurances. We had over 200 employees at Vance Innovations. Loyal, brilliant people. Within a year of the takeover, 90% of them were gone. The company was dismantled, its assets sold for scrap, its mission of creating affordable solar technology tossed aside so he could turn a quick profit." Klaus Richter slowly stood up. He was a tall man, and his presence now seemed to fill the small alcove. He looked down at Julian, his expression one of profound, icy disgust. "I remember David Vance," Klaus said, his voice a low rumble. "I met him at a green energy conference in Geneva in 2018. A good man, an honorable man. He spoke of his work with passion. He spoke of his daughter, the brilliant linguist at Brown University." His eyes met Alara's, and a flicker of recognition, of dawning comprehension, passed between them. He finally saw her. Not as a waitress, but as the daughter her father had spoken of with such pride. The mention of her father's pride, of that forgotten, brighter version of herself, was almost her undoing. A wave of grief washed over her, so powerful it made her knees weak. But she held her ground, fueled by adrenaline and a righteous fury. Julian, seeing the allegiance of his partner shift so completely, grew desperate. His mask of sophistication was gone, replaced by the raw, ugly face of a cornered bully. "This is absurd! A conspiracy! She's lying! You're going to take the word of a common waitress over a multi-billion-dollar partnership?" "She is not a common waitress," Klaus said coldly. "She is David Vance's daughter, and she has the one thing you seem to lack, Mr. Croft: credibility." Klaus then turned to Marcus. "Marcus, our discussion is over." He tossed his linen napkin onto the table, a gesture of finality. "The deal is off. Richter Automotive will not be doing business with a man of your character. I would rather see our company burned to the ground than handed over to a corporate hyena like you." The words struck Julian harder than any physical blow. The deal, worth hundreds of millions, the crowning achievement of his year, evaporated before his eyes. Marcus Weber, looking terrified of his superior's wrath, but resolute in his agreement, stood as well. "I concur completely, Klaus." He wouldn't even look at Julian. The two Germans turned and walked out of the alcove without a backward glance. The velvet curtains swished shut behind them, leaving Julian Croft alone in his humiliating defeat, facing his accuser. The power dynamic had been inverted with breathtaking speed. The king was dethroned, his kingdom shrinking to the size of a single candlelit table. He stared at Alara, his face a canvas of disbelief, hatred, and pathetic bewilderment. "You," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You ruined me." "No," Alara replied, her voice soft but unforgiving. "You ruined yourself. You just made the mistake of bragging about it to the wrong person." Mr. Dubois, who had witnessed the entire exchange in stunned silence, finally understood the magnitude of what had happened. His allegiance, always to power and money, was now scrambled. But looking at Julian's pathetic, defeated form, and Alara's quiet, powerful dignity, he made a choice. He stepped forward, no longer addressing Julian as a revered guest. "Sir, I think it's time for you to leave." Julian just stared, his mind unable to compute. Being asked to leave? By a restaurant manager? The indignity was absolute. He looked around the alcove, at the half-eaten, obscenely expensive steak, the decanted wine, the glittering city that was supposed to be his, and it all felt like a mockery. He stumbled backward, knocking into the serving tray. The water pitcher clattered to the floor, finally shattering, the sound as definitive as a gavel strike. Without another word, Julian Croft turned and fled, a disgraced emperor running from his own fallen Colosseum. Alara stood amidst the wreckage, her body trembling with the release of 2 years of pent-up adrenaline and grief. She had done it. She had faced the monster, and she had won. She looked at the shattered pitcher on the floor, the water spreading across the carpet like spilled tears. For the first time in a very long time, she felt like she could finally begin to clean up the mess. The immediate aftermath in the alcove was strangely quiet. The grand drama had concluded, leaving only Alara, the stunned Mr. Dubois, and the remnants of a multi-million-dollar deal on the table. The silence was broken only by Alara's ragged breathing as the adrenaline began to recede, leaving a profound, bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. "Alara, Mr. Dubois started, his face pale. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. The invisible waitress was suddenly the most formidable person he knew. "I had no idea." "Neither did I," she whispered, more to herself than to him. She had never imagined this confrontation, never planned a revenge. It had been a spontaneous eruption of truth, born of insult and memory. Her shift was, needless to say, over. Mr. Dubois, in a rare moment of human empathy overriding his managerial rigidity, simply told her to go home. "We'll sort this out tomorrow," he said, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. Alara walked out of Ethelgard's in a daze. The cool night air hit her face, a welcome shock after the superheated atmosphere of the restaurant. She didn't take a cab or the subway. She just walked, her worn-out work shoes silent on the pavement. The city lights, which from the alcove had seemed like a conquered territory for men like Croft, now looked different. They looked like possibilities. She expected to feel triumphant, but instead she felt a hollow ache. Exposing Julian hadn't brought her father back. It hadn't erased the pain of the last 2 years. But as she walked, a new feeling began to surface, a sense of peace. The heavy cloak of victimhood she had been wearing for so long had been thrown off. She hadn't just been a waitress tonight, she had been Alara Vance. The next morning her phone rang. It was an unknown number with a German country code. Hesitantly she answered. "Miss Vance? This is Klaus Richter." Her heart leaped into her throat. "Mr. Richter, good morning. I owe you a profound apology and an even more profound debt of gratitude," he said, his voice formal but sincere. "You saved my company from a disastrous mistake. What you did last night, it took a courage I have seldom seen." "I just told the truth," Alara said quietly. "The truth is a rare and valuable commodity in our world," he replied. "I did some research last night, on you and on Vance Innovations. Everything you said was correct. Croft's methods were predatory. What he did to your father was unconscionable." There was a pause. "I am flying back to Stuttgart this afternoon, but I wanted to make you an offer. Richter Automotive is opening a North American acquisitions and analysis division. We need someone to lead it, someone with integrity, a sharp mind, and a deep understanding of both the language and the more unsavory tactics one might encounter in American corporate culture." Alara was speechless. A job offer, a career, just like that? I don't know what to say, she stammered. I'm a waitress. No, Klaus corrected her gently. You were a waitress. You are a graduate of Brown University with a specialization in linguistics, and I suspect a brilliant strategic mind inherited from your father. Your resume is the story you told last night. The position is yours if you want it. Think about it. My personal assistant will email you the details. She hung up the phone, her hand trembling. It was too much to process. A door she thought was sealed forever had just been blown off its hinges. Meanwhile, the ripples from the previous night were already turning into a tidal wave for Julian Croft. The news of the Richter deal collapsing spread through the financial world like wildfire. Rumors flew, but with no official explanation, Croft Industries' stock began to waver. Investors grew nervous. A collapsed deal of this magnitude suggested a deep, underlying problem. Julian tried to do damage control. He released a statement citing irreconcilable cultural differences with Richter Automotive. But Klaus Richter, a man who valued honor above all, refused to play along. When contacted by the Wall Street Journal, he gave a short, devastating quote. We require partners who exhibit the highest degree of corporate and personal integrity. Mr. Croft failed to meet that standard. It was a kill shot. The vague statement hinted at a scandal far more interesting than a simple failed merger. Financial journalists, smelling blood in the water, began digging. They started looking into Croft's past deals, his aggressive acquisition strategies, and they started looking into the spectacular collapse of a promising green energy firm called Vance Innovations. An investigative reporter from a major newspaper managed to track down some of the laid-off engineers from her father's company. Emboldened by the news of Croft's public stumble, they began to talk. They spoke of a brilliant, kind boss in David Vance and a ruthless, hostile takeover that had destroyed their work. They mentioned patents being sold for a fraction of their worth, of proprietary technology showing up in other Croft-owned subsidiaries. The story snowballed. The Nightingale strategy, as the reporters dubbed it after an anonymous tip, became a headline. Julian Croft, the corporate golden boy, was being recast as a villain. The SEC launched a formal investigation into his acquisition practices, specifically looking at the asset stripping of Vance Innovations. His board of directors, terrified of the scandal, called an emergency meeting. Julian found himself in a new kind of prison. The adulation he fed on was gone, replaced by suspicion and contempt. His phone, which once buzzed with fawning calls, was now silent, or buzzed with furious demands from his board and his lawyers. The man who controlled every room he entered was now a pariah, trapped in his penthouse apartment, watching his empire crumble on the news. The ecosystem he had so arrogantly described at dinner had been thrown into chaos, all by the one creature he had deemed completely insignificant. 3 months later, Alara stood in a glass-walled corner office on the 45th floor of a skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan. The view was even more spectacular than the one from the alcove at Ethelgard's, but she saw it differently now. It wasn't a kingdom to be conquered. It was a city full of stories, of struggles and successes, a complex ecosystem she was now a part of in a meaningful way. The nameplate on her door read, Alara Vance, Head of North American Strategy and Development, Richter Automotive. She had accepted Klaus Richter's offer. The first few weeks had been a whirlwind of contracts, briefings, and a trip to the company's headquarters in Stuttgart. She had walked through the state-of-the-art facilities, meeting the engineers and designers whose work she had saved. They didn't see a waitress. They saw the woman who had stood up to a corporate shark, the daughter of a fellow innovator they respected. For the first time in years, she felt like she belonged. Her linguistic skills and her intimate understanding of predatory corporate tactics made her uniquely suited for the role. She analyzed potential partnerships and acquisition targets with a keen eye, looking beyond the balance sheets to the culture, the people, the integrity of the leadership. Klaus had given her a simple directive: help us grow, but help us grow honorably. Her first major proposal was on his desk now. It wasn't about acquiring a competitor. It was about creating something new. She had proposed that Richter Automotive use a portion of its R&D budget to create a new independent foundation, a foundation dedicated to funding and mentoring small, innovative green energy startups the kind of company Vance Innovations had been. She wanted to call it the David Vance Initiative. She had poured her heart into the proposal, working late nights, using the business acumen she didn't know she had, a latent inheritance from her father. It was a way to rebuild his legacy, not by reclaiming what was lost, but by planting new seeds for the future. Her phone buzzed. It was a news alert. Julian Croft resigns as CEO of Croft Industries amidst SEC investigation in plummeting stock. The article detailed his fall from grace. He was facing multiple lawsuits from former shareholders and was personally named in the SEC probe. His reputation was in tatters, his career over. He had become the ghost now, a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms. Ilara felt a quiet, somber sense of closure. It wasn't joy, but a feeling that justice, in its own slow, grinding way, had been served. A knock on her office door brought her back to the present. It was Klaus Richter, who was visiting the New York office for the week. He held a tablet in his hand, her proposal displayed on the screen. "Ilara," he said, his expression serious, "I have read your proposal for the David Vance Initiative." Her heart pounded. "And?" A slow smile spread across his face. "The board approved it this morning, unanimously. We are prepared to seed it with an initial $10 million, and we want you to be the chairperson of its board." Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, hot and sudden. They weren't tears of grief or anger, but of overwhelming gratitude and release. $10 million. It was more than her father had ever dreamed of. It was a chance to help dozens of other David Vances, to protect them from the Julian Crofts of the world. "Thank you, Klaus," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." "No, Ilara," he said, placing a fatherly hand on her shoulder. "Thank you. You reminded us what we are fighting for." Later that evening, Ilara walked home through the bustling city streets. She passed restaurants with people dining behind glass windows, their lives playing out in brief, silent vignettes. She imagined the waiters and waitresses inside, the invisible people with their own hidden stories, their own buried talents, their own sleeping courage. She had been one of them. She had been a ghost, haunting the ruins of her own life. But a single moment of defiance, a refusal to be invisible any longer, had changed everything. She hadn't just exposed a villain, she had reclaimed her own name, her own future. She was no longer just the daughter of David Vance. She was his legacy, burning brighter than ever before. And as the city lights came on, painting the twilight sky in hues of orange and gold, Ilara Vance smiled, ready for the new day to dawn. So what can we take away from Ilara's incredible story? It's a powerful reminder that there is a story behind every face, an immense strength hidden within every person, no matter their station in life. Ilara Vance was invisible, dismissed, and mocked, but she carried a fire within her, a fire of knowledge, grief, and an unbreakable sense of justice. When the moment came, she didn't just speak up, she unleashed a reckoning that toppled an empire. Her journey teaches us that our past doesn't have to be a prison, it can be our greatest weapon. It reminds us that dignity isn't given by a job title or a bank account. It's something we claim for ourselves. If Ilara's story of courage and vindication moved you, please give this video a like to show your support. Share it with someone who might need a reminder of their own inner strength. And of course, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell for more real-life stories of justice, resilience, and the incredible power of the human spirit. Thank you for listening.